Hello, my name is Leo, and today we will be covering the movement and how to use the pawn in chess. So the first thing to know is, what is the pawn? It's worth 1 point, and there's 8 on either side of the chessboard. It's these on the 2nd and 7th rank. What I mean by rank is these columns. If you look at this number, 2 and 7, all across the 7th and all across the 2nd are only pawns. Now, for traditional pawn movement, they can only move forward 1. And they can only move forward. They cannot move diagonally. They cannot get off of their file. So A, B, C. That's traditional pawn movement. Now, there's a lot of exceptions to this for the pawn. The first is when the pawn can move more than 1. As you can see right there, the pawn can move 2. And this is because it was that pawn's first move of the game. You interact switching moves, and what I mean by that pawn's first move of the game is that pawn hadn't been moved yet, so it was allowed to move forward 2. So this black pawn can move forward 2, or it can move forward 1. Either works. If you want an example of this in a game, I'm going to come right here. So this is a bit later in a game. Here is the pawn. You can see it hasn't been moved yet because it's still on its starting square, so it can move forward 2. I actually think it's black to move. So you can see this pawn can move forward 2. But this pawn can also just move forward 1. But if you look at this pawn right here, this one cannot move forward 2 because it already moved off of its starting square. It can only move forward 1. And if you're actually looking closely at this board, you'll see that this pawn right here, let me highlight it in red, is actually off of its starting file, the H file, and it's on the G file. I'll explain how it did that in about a second. So the pawn, alongside with moving forward 1 or 2 on its second move on its first move of the game, or any subsequent move, the pawn can actually capture diagonally. So let me highlight this pawn in red. It can capture right here and right here, but it can only go to those squares when it's captured. So let me set up an example here. So this pawn right here can move off of its starting file because it captured diagonally. Now the pawn can only capture diagonally up left and up right. That's the only place it can capture, meaning that this pawn is stuck right here. So let's say black weren't to move their pawn there and they moved it there. This pawn is completely stuck. It can't move until it can capture, or this gets captured. This pawn gets captured. Moving back, so the pawn can get stuck. It doesn't just get stuck on other pawns. The pawn can also get stuck on pieces. So you can see this pawn can't go forward, but it would be able to catch the knight if the knight were like on this square, because then it can take it diagonally. That's the only way the pawn can capture like that. Now let's say we moved the knight down here. The pawn cannot capture the knight because it can only go backward. It cannot go backwards. It can only move forward, up left, and up right. The reason the king's flashing reds, because that's a check. The knight's hitting the king. But this pawn right here can capture that, and it gets off of its home file. Another interesting thing to know about pawns is when they reach the end of the board, the enemy end of the board, such as with this position, where we have these white pawns that started down on this 2nd rank over here. I believe this pawn actually did start where this rook is now. Now that it's white's move, you can move the pawn to the very end, and it so-called promotes to a better piece. You can turn into a knight, a rook, a bishop, or a queen. Normally the best case scenario is to be a queen. What this means for the pawn is if you get a pawn to the end, you can potentially have 2 queens on the board. You aren't limited to 1 queen on the board. When the pawn gets to the end, you can double up and have 2 queens. Important strategies regarding pawns are that they can defend themselves and also other pieces. That's their primary use. If you look at this pawn right here, it's being defended by this pawn, which can take, if something perhaps takes this pawn, it can be captured. And then this pawn is being defended by this pawn, like that. So let's say this knight were to swoop down here. This pawn would be defending that square. Pawns also defend empty squares. So let's say black just preferred to move. And then I went here. You can see that this pawn is defending this knight. So theoretically, if this knight were to take this knight, the pawn could take that, putting this in a tough situation where you're attacking the queen. So the queen would have to come out, which you don't really want in this position. I'm sure Brian might explain something like that later in the series. Something else interesting about this is a fork. So the pawn is hitting both of these pieces at once. So let's say black didn't do anything. You would have the choice to take either of these pieces. And let's say that black moved their knight. You could just take a queen. So they're kind of forced to do something about that pawn. Thank you for listening about pawns. That's all I have for the pawn right now.